Fiction Prize. And her second book, The Dark, was nominated for the Canadian Authors Award. Caroline Adderson teaches in the Writing and Publishing program at SFU and is the author of 5 novels, 2 collections of short stories, as well as many children's books. She has been nominated for numerous literary prizes, including the Impact Dublin Literary Award, the Giller Prize, the Governor General's Award, and the Rogers Writers Trust Award. She is also the winner of 3 BC Book Prizes and 3 CBC Literary Awards. Dede Crane is a former professional ballet dancer, choreographer, and teacher. She is the author of 5 books of fiction and a co-editor of Great Expectations, Essays on Childbirth. Her work has been shortlisted for the CBC Literary Prize, the Western Magazine Award, and she has twice been a finalist for the Victoria Book Prizes. Shayna Lambert is a novelist, short story writer, and teacher, and the author of 2 novels and 2 short story collections. Her work has received critical acclaim in Canada and internationally, and she has been nominated for the Rogers Writers Trust Prize, the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize, and the Frank O'Connor Award for the short story. And now I will pass you over to Claire Mulligan and the authors to get us started on the fun part of the evening.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thanks to Munro's and HarperCollins for hosting this event, and to everyone out there who has taken the time to join us for this. It's going to be a really nice night. I had the privilege of reading all 3 of these novels in succession, Petra, A Russia's Sister, and One Madder Woman. And it was, I found it just amazing how they were all so distinctive, and yet they all seem to inform and enrich each other, right? They have similar themes. There's, you know, the power of art is prevalent in each book. We have the struggles of women in this male-dominated societies, and the sort of different paths that love takes in each novel is very unique. But to begin, and as a way to introduce your novels, I wanted to ask a question, which is, what question or questions did you ask of these historic characters that made you realize their stories had to be told or explored, right? And we'll start with Dede and One Madder Woman.
Thanks, Claire. I like to do my quick summary of One Madder Woman is that it's a love story between 2 sisters, between a genius and her art, and between Bertha Morisot and the bad boy of the Paris salon, Edward Manet, who happened to paint Morisot more than any other model. So one of the many things I wanted to try to understand was what took her from painting like this in the romantic style, trying to capture the true image. This is called At the Water's Edge. It showed at the Paris Salon in '65. To this next painting, which is not about capturing the true image, but the true feeling, the living quality of that moment of children playing with a bowl of water. And this isn't, she's not copying, you have to understand, she's not copying from anybody. This is her original vision and an example of Impressionism. Or this next one, a woman at her toilette, where you can practically smell how clean and lightly fragrant she is. Or all that white, capturing that freshness of the anticipation of an exciting event. Another thing I wanted to find out is the nature of her relationship with Edward Manet, because historians can't agree. Some say they were only colleagues and friends, and others say, oh no, way more scandalous. He was a married man. So I studied his paintings of her, and this next painting called Repose. This is the second painting he ever did of her, and if you can see it all closely, she looks quite self-conscious and awkward and kind of perched in her body and kind of self-protective. So what changed just a couple years later from this to this next painting a couple years later, Woman with a Fan, where it's very playful, it's intimate, she's baring her ankle. So my job was to find out the truth of their relationship. Basically, my novel tells the stories behind the paintings. I'll pass it back over to you.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Shayna and Petra. And what questions did you have of your character?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you. And it's such an honor to be here and so delightful to be at Munro's Books, Munro's is such a wonderful bookstore, and I love to go there every time I'm in Victoria. Caroline and I are here we're here from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And we just wanted to acknowledge their full rights to their title and celebrate the incredible creativity that they create and that we are allowed to participate in. Yeah, so this first picture, so the question is, you know, what did I ask of Petra before I began this long process of writing the novel? And this picture was really important to me because Petra is the founder of the German Green Party, and she was also the sort of charismatic leader of the fight against nuclear missiles in Germany in the 80s. And I met her. She came to Vancouver to participate in the Vancouver Peace Festival. And I was the coordinator of that Peace Festival. And she sent that picture to us. All the other people who came to speak at the festival that we were organizing, it was Centennial in '86, sent very serious headshots. And she sent this sexy picture of her leaning against the tree. So she was already different from the other people that were sort of gathering to participate. And she came and she just absolutely knocked my socks off with her charismatic, incredibly inclusive vision that included, you know, rights for Indigenous people and First Nations and free love and, you know, sexual intimacy. And she was talking about all of this on stage. And really, as a young woman, I really felt like I was having blinders taken off my eyes. And then all the time that we were sort of organizing this, she was tagged everywhere by this German NATO general who was her lover. And so I found that so fascinating. And it was only years later that I was at Checkpoint Charlie in East Berlin, you know, on the border between East and West Berlin. And I went to the small independent museum, and there again was this same picture of her leaning against the tree. And it was at that point that the novel seed sort of fell into me, that you were asking about, Claire. And that was when I thought, I'm going to write this. I'm going to turn this into something. So if you could turn to the next slide. Yes. So a lot of times when I'm teaching fiction, I talk about, you know, try to find something that inspires you. That is, and this picture, which I found somewhere on the internet, I can't even figure out where, was so incredibly inspiring to me just on a visual level. And I think that's because it represents in some kind of iconic form that weird military nuclear dance between the two key figures, Petra and her general. And the wolf, I worked a lot with a wolf before eventually writing a book with no wolves in it. But I love how the warrior is standing there with these two spears kind of talismanically holding off the wolf, but also they're also frozen. I love the teeth on the wolf. I love the look on its face. I love the expression of sort of mythological frozenness. And yet at the same time, it seems like a lot is happening. And I think the thing I love most about this picture, which by the way, I would stick it on books as I was working longhand, like I just transfer it from book to book, and sometimes I'd have it up on my wall. But I think the thing I loved most about it and still love so much about it is I've never really understood it. And I think that's an important, you know, that if you feel like you can get to the bottom of what your novel is about on an archetypal or mythological level, then it's probably not interesting enough. So I was always interested in this picture. So if you could just go quickly to the next slide. Thanks. And so this was an early draft. I was going to write this as a play. And so you see sort of mid-center there, I'm pointing, but of course you can't see where I'm pointing. There's a wolf. And there's also something that says number 13, election victory, because this was very important that the Greens, that Petra, incredible Petra Kelly was leading, half German, half American. She was leading the Green Party to an enormous election victory in 1983. And that victory and the subsequent kind of what I don't know what to do, subsequent sort of conflagration as they actually came to power and had to test their power in Parliament is a big part of the book. And then also down at the bottom, I'm starting to play with the idea of a narrator, and that became my narrator, Manfred, who tells the story. So if you could just go to the next picture, thank you. And this is my final slide. This is beautiful, beautiful Petra Kelly. And you know, I went to Germany and I interviewed a lot of people, and they were frustrated with her. They found her a bundle of contradictions. She was a narcissist, and yet she was incredibly generous to people who needed her help. Never forgot, for instance, Tibetan refugees. Never forgot the people on the other side of the wall who were fighting for freedom and were often imprisoned. She was a charismatic believer in nonviolence, and yet she got involved with a military man. So there were always these contradictions in her. And I, you know, when I did go to Germany and meet these people, they had so much patience for her. I mean, she's been dead for 28 years, but you could kind of tell that, as well as that, they were still in love with her, the men and the women. She was unforgettable. And I think ultimately that was part of what drew me along as well. Like I was in love with her as a fascinating, extremely complex bundle of contradictions. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shayna. It was wonderful. So interesting.
Thanks.
I didn't know it was going to be a start as a play. That's so interesting. Yeah. Caroline, can we go over to you, please? And
yes. Yes. Again, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, HarperCollins. Thank you, Munro Books. What drew me to this story? Well, I've had a Chekhov thing all my adult reading life, ever since I discovered the Russians when I was a teenager and saw them on my parents' shelf. But I've been true to Anton Chekhov. So what I really wanted to write about was, why was he a steadfast bachelor all his life, and then 3 years before he died, he got married and never lived with his wife. But as I started to research that, I realized that that would be a story about a dying man in a boring seaside town quarreling with his female relatives. In other words, not a lot of outward action or any outdoor action. So by then I had discovered the story of Lika Mizanova. So what the novel became is a novel about the relationship between Anton Chekhov and his sister Masha, as seen through Masha's eyes. She's the protagonist, and it tells the true story of the tragedy behind his breakthrough play, The Seagull, and Masha's involvement in it. In the novel, like in the play, everybody is in love with the wrong everybody else, including a mongoose. So what we have here is a picture that was taken in 1890, the morning that Chekhov went on a 9-month grueling voyage to the Sakhalin Island penal colony. And in this picture, you see the dramatis personae of everybody in the novel, or most of the important people in the novel. So that's Chekhov in the pale jacket, and above his right shoulder is Masha. Now, the young woman who's circled, that is Lika Mizanova, who eventually became the model for Nina in The Seagull. And you may notice that their seated positions form a triangle, and it's kind of a love triangle, and not the only one in the book. The youngest Chekhov sibling is Misha, and he's the one cross-legged with the cap and the pince-nez. And if you look carefully, you'll see he's holding a hen in his lap. If you want to know why, you have to read the book. And those are Chekhov's parents on the right of the picture. Next slide, please. So I traveled to Russia in 2015 to research the book. And so I thought I'd show you the setting for where the novel opens. So this is the Chekhov house in Moscow. And the story begins the night that Masha invites Lika to come over and meet her famous writer brother. So Chekhov referred to this house as the chest of drawers house because of those 4 bay windows looking like the drawers in a dresser. Next slide, please. Since I mentioned the mongoose, he's such an important character in the novel, I thought I would show you a picture of him. So when Chekhov was on his way back from Sakhalin Island, he stopped in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, and he bought a mongoose in a market. And he named him, or he was named by some sailors, Svoloch, which actually means bastard in Russian. And then he decided he needed a wife for this mongoose, so we went back and bought a civet cat by accident, and this creates a lot of complications in the novel, as it did in the Chekhov's actual life. And next slide. And this is Melikova, which is Chekhov's estate outside Moscow, and this is where the second half of the novel takes place, where Chekhov wrote many of his important works, including The Seagull. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was marvelous. This brings me to my next question, which is about research. These are historical fiction novels. Even, you know, the 80s is already such a historical time. It's crazy. It is. And and I know all of you went to these places to meta research, you know, to really be there. And I find that fascinating. And since we're all rather housebound and nobody's traveling much, maybe you can take us there a little bit and tell us a little bit about that, what it was like to be there researching, anecdotes, something that inspired you. Anything like that would be wonderful. I'll start with, go backwards. Can I start with Dede again? You all right?
Oh, sure. Well, it was just great to be in Paris, because Paris is Paris and just so beautiful. I should say, in case people didn't know, I take it for granted that people know who Berthe Morisot was, but some people don't know that she was the one female impressionist painter of the original group of impressionists. Some people never heard of her. I hadn't heard of her before. I knew all the guys, but didn't know her. So when I was there, I sought out her paintings, and in the 16th, at the Marmottan Museum, they have they own the most Morisots. And they also have the biggest collection of Monets, who's my other favorite impressionist. So it was great. What was great for me was to go there and see these paintings, you know, the originals in the flesh, so to speak. And to me, as a novelist, they were just so revealing. The other place that was really revealing was going to see her grave, oddly enough. I didn't expect that. And the configuration of her grave in relationship to Edward Manet's was also very telling for me.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Caroline and a Russian sister.
Well, I actually went to Russia about 6 months after they illegally annexed the Crimea. And I was going to Crimea too, because originally when I started writing the book, I didn't know that I would have this just 7-year time frame. I thought I was doing all of Chekhov's life. And so I was very, very nervous. Everything we saw on television was about, you know, armed conflict and tanks rolling through the streets. And I called my Russian friend, who said, "Oh, no problem, no problem." And then she phoned me back, you know, shortly before I left and said, "I changed my mind," because her friend had an experience where she's getting on the plane from Moscow to Kiev, and the passport officer took her passport and tore a page out and said, "Well, you can't get on the plane. There's a page missing from your passport." So I was really scared. And then I landed there, and I was afraid to leave the hotel. But then I was hungry, and I left, and I noticed nobody even looked at me. So it was fine. And I had a guide everywhere anyway, because I don't speak any Russian. But then when I went to Crimea itself, I was more nervous. And when I landed there, I was met by the whole entourage of the tour company, because I was the only Westerner who had come to Crimea since this international incident. And she said to me, "I just had to meet this very brave Canadian woman." And then when we were driving from Sevastopol to Yalta, you know, there were big Putin signs. He looked down on us like a reptile. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but it also happened to be my birthday. And I checked into the hotel and I went straight out. And on my birthday, I walked the Yalta Promenade, just like in Lady with a Lapdog. So it was kind of like a dream come true.
That's wonderful. Lady with a Lapdog is one of Chekhov's most famous stories.
Yes.
Shayna, what about you?
Well, yeah, those are amazing stories. Just in response to what Dede said, I also went to Petra Kelly's grave. I wasn't planning to, but I was close to where it was. It's just outside of Würzburg. And so we went, and it ended up being incredibly meaningful to me. And it ended up becoming a central kind of, motif halfway through the book of my central character. My observing narrator goes to the grave, and it was wonderful because in those graveyards just outside of Würzburg, and I think in other beautiful graveyards in Germany, they plant flowers all over the graves, and so this grave was completely covered in pansies. So my husband and I went and got the watering can and watered Petra Kelly's grave, and it was really meaningful. But the quick story I'll tell isn't actually that one. It's that, she had so many friends, lovers, ex-lovers. She was an incredible believer in women's emancipation and free love and polyamory. And so so I got in contact with a number of these people, and one of them invited me to his place, again, not too far from Würzburg, up in more in the southern Germany. And a day before I got there, he wrote to me and he said, listen, when you come for lunch, because he'd invited us for lunch, he said, just don't tell my wife you're writing about Petra Kelly. Tell her you're just writing about the Greens, would you please? Because it turned out, Petra had been dead for 28 years, but his wife was still jealous. So we went out, so we had a beautiful lunch. We ate, spargel soup, that's a white asparagus soup. And then afterwards, Bob, my partner, left and his wife left, and then he took me way up to this pagoda up at the top of their property, and he brought out his file on Petra Kelly, and you could see that he was still in love with her memory. And that also became a really important part of the book, the psychology of him, what he looked like as he spoke to me, the intensity of his continued adoration of a ghost became a part of the story. So that was a really, really fascinating connection. And unfortunately, he died. He died before the book has come out, because he would be really somebody I would want to share this book with. That was unfortunately not to be, but several other very helpful men and women have had copies of the book. So that's really nice.
I just want to add that I too went to Chekhov's grave.
Oh, did you?
We're all, yes.
Yeah.
It's just the thing you do. Yes.
Yeah.
I
know. What's that like, Caroline? Can you tell us briefly?
Pardon me?
What was that like? Can you tell us briefly?
Oh, he has the most beautiful grave. It's kind of very tall. It's very Art Deco looking. And then on the gravestone is the seagull, because that became the logo for the Moscow Arts Theater, which is the company that resurrected all his plays and are responsible for making him the famous, well-known playwright that he is. He was not understood during the first productions of his work. So it's a very beautiful image, and it's in all the on his grave. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Fascinating. Now, I'm convinced after I read these three books that Petra, Masha, and Berthe, they would have been friends. I can just see them getting together, right? And they would have asked each other questions. So for this next section, I'd like to ask actually each of you to ask the other two a question about their novel. I know we've all read each other's novels. And if your character wants to ask the other character a question, that can work too. However you want to do it. That'd be lovely. I will start back with, I guess Dede, we'll just.
Okay, we'll just go around like that. Yeah. Well, I just kept thinking of point of view, and I was fascinated with both your choices. Shayna, I couldn't think of a book that I'd read that had a first person point of view and then all sorts of third person points of view. I thought it was fascinating, and you pulled it off beautifully.
Thank you.
But why did you choose that, and how did you pull it off?
Well, you know, I think that it kind of chose me. I mean, I started this, you know, like I said, when I was at Checkpoint Charlie and I looked up at her picture and in this little independent museum and I saw her face and I said, that will make a great play, you know? And then I started to work on it as a play and then I sort of got nowhere. And then I would say to myself kind of very slowly, the reason it's not working is because you're not a playwright. Start again and write it as a novel, right? But about the second or third time that I did that, I brought this narrator along with me.
Oh, okay, so the
And
first person's like the narrator, yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted him to be like a Nick Carraway, you know, like he's observing the scene, but then he's also a part of the scene. And you know, I had some difficulties with that. Some people didn't like it, but I got incredibly wedded to telling it through his eyes. And I realized only very close to the very end that this was because his trajectory in the novel is very different from what happens to Petra Kelly and her general. And so he has to be a foil there. He has to be there because he represents a different set of minute choices that end up creating a different outcome. And I wanted to do that study, you know, of how people behave on a minute level and how it affects them over time. So I think that was why he was there. Yeah. And then because he's imagining, he gets to imagine other people's heads and he gets to go in and travel around inside their brains. And I sort of set that up at the beginning of the book that he has that he decides he's not writing a conventional memoir. He's going to have to use his imagination, and that Petra is telling him, yes, do it. You know, so that's sort of his justification is he's told by this ghost that inhabits him, go do it fully. And that means an imaginative leap into other people's skins, which as a novelist, I believe in very deeply. I'm sure you guys do too, that one of our jobs is to be imaginatively creative and go into other people's skins. So that's what she tells him to do.
Yeah, it's quite a brilliant approach because instead of having that narrow first person thing where you can't see what's going on in other people's heads, you do, but really it's through him. So it kind of fools you. You've got this, yeah, it's just extraordinary effect it has.
Yeah, really original too.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
So now I've got a question. So I'm going to ask my question to Caroline. Caroline, you spend so much time with Chekhov, looking at him through Masha's point of view, watching these lovers come and go. And my question to you is, and you depict him so beautifully. You know, we come to love him as a brother. We love him as a lover. We love him because he dresses really nicely. He's invariably polite to the callers who come and bore him. So did you ever feel that you were falling a little in love with him?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hemorrhoids and all. Yeah. He could be quite prickly too, you know, but mostly Masha saw that, mostly the family, Masha and the mother, you know, he could only be prickly to the people he truly loved, and he couldn't really love. That's a big part of what the novel is about, is what happens to us in childhood and how it affects our abilities to love. But yeah, it was lovely. It was lovely falling in love with him. And I actually started trying to write it from his point of view, and it didn't work at all. Interestingly, because I have so much that's actually in his voice, like, you know, many letters are published, and then of course all his work, and yet I couldn't do it. And as soon as I switched to Masha, it just was so easy, because I felt this is so much easier for me to connect to how she felt and how she would have felt in her position. Yeah.
And yet you're not in his point of view particularly, but and in hers. And yet by the end of the book, I felt I knew him so well. And yes, and I fell in love with him too. With
I think
all
we know
his
him.
complications, they were all somehow redeemable and lovable. And yeah.
I think we know him better because he's seen through Masha's eyes, you know? I think that portrait is more precise. It's almost microscopic from this sister. That we see his faults too. I mean, I've been saying about your novel that Masha knows him better than he knows himself.
Yes, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's very true.
And vice
Yeah.
versa, I'd say that too.
Mm.
He knows Masha more than she knows herself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating relationship.
I had a, it could actually be either for both of you, but there was one thing I thought was interesting that was the same in our novels, Dede. So I'm going to put the question out first and make it more specifically for Dede, and then I'm hoping Shayna can answer it too, because I'll make it specific to her too. So in my portrayal of Masha, and probably the reason it took me 6 years to do it was my worry about female representation. And I realized I was writing about a person who was entirely dependent on her brother financially, and at the start of the novel anyway, emotionally. And that she, by virtue of, being alive in the mid 19th century, had very little agency. And I just didn't want a passive protagonist, and I didn't want to be stereotypic. So I was wondering how you dealt with this problem, because obviously, Dede, you have the same situation, and Bert was under the same power by her father. And in your case, Shayna, it struck me that Petra actually was powerful and had so much agency, but then she made this very, what we'd say today, problematic decision in love, in that she chooses to fall in love and enter a relationship that seems from the outside almost like the choice to be submissive. There was something kind of creepy about it. So, so one thing I was wondering in your book, Dede, was your character of Marcello, because she seemed to me to be very much like the character of Tanya Shevchikina Kupernik in A Russian Sister, who for me was like the model of the woman who wasn't allowing this to get her down. So she was a poet and a playwright and bisexual, and there's a big scandal in the middle of the book, and it involves her. And so you had Marcello, who was an artist in her own, doing her own thing, and bisexual too. So I thought, wow, this is like incredible. We never hear about these characters. So anyway, this is a very diffuse questions I'm asking.
Yeah, that's okay. She was a great example for Morisot of a woman who could make it without a husband, support herself, be an artist. Of course, she chose that name, Marcello. Is it Marcello or Marcello with one C? I have no idea. Because it was a man's name. So when she submitted things to the salon, they'd think, oh, this is from a man, so more likely to get accepted. But she was a great example, and she was just fearless too. But I was thinking that how powerless, we were talking about this before, how powerless like Berta was in that male-dominated society, and trying to make it in a profession that was completely male-dominated. I mean, they weren't even allowed to go to the life drawing studios, women, or the school, they both are, they weren't accepted, they weren't allowed. So they had to just try to make it on their own, despite all the obstacles. But for her, I think all the obstacles just made her more obstinate, or at least I made her that obstinate, because I don't know how she could have succeeded the way she did. But yeah, the first instinct is were they passive? Because they were kind of forced to be passive in that society. So how did they get around that? And I just made her obstinate.
And Dede, I think, so having read your book and admired it so incredibly much, one of the things I think that you do is you're sure society is squishing her into a box, but she is always seeing like an artist. And so she walks out onto the street, and you give her that genius's vision of looking at light and shadow and seeing things. And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, I was so swept up in how Berta saw the world, often just before she decided to paint it. Can you just talk a little bit about that, and as a part of the novel?
I don't know if I can, actually. Because I'm not a visual artist at all. I even had to I took a drawing course at the university, because I literally couldn't draw anything. And I even took a painting workshop Yeah, I don't know. I just had to get, like you were saying before, you have to inhabit the character. So I just tried to, I mostly studied the paintings and thought from there and tried to just see what she might have seen and bring in the different influences of the other painters that she was showing alongside and admiring at the time. Yeah, just as I think any artist in any discipline, we've all had that experience of those kind of not transcendent moments, but so I guess I would try to capture that in another medium.
Well, I really feel like you did it beautifully. I was so swept up in how she saw the world. That sort of answered. So for me, like for people who haven't read the book yet, that answered the passive question, because I know she was, yeah, there was no question there was so much confinement on her, and yet she was so brilliant. But when she would walk out onto the street or have all of these experiences, you get to see it through her eyes. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And can you address Petra's love choices and this dominant submissive thing?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, yes, she made some, as you said, problematic love choices. And if those three women sat down, I was picturing them before, because Claire said, you know, what happens if the three women, or maybe it was Caroline who said that there's actually 6 of us here, because the 3 women are Berta and Masha and Petra are also here. So if they were all to sit down at a bistro table and talk, I mean, I think that Petra would talk a lot, and she would be quite bossy and opinionated, and she would probably alienate the other 2. I wasn't convinced they'd be good friends at all. I thought they might be kicking each other under the table, saying, would this woman ever shut up? And yet when it came to the subject of love, their voices would deepen, and they would all have something to share. And for Petra, you know, she loved extremely deeply, and for whatever reasons, people who knew her intimately said she did have, she often got involved with men who were 20, even 30 years her senior. And so she falls in love with this man who is from a whole other generation. I think that was part of the mystery and fascination. He was from the war generation. She was a woman of the post-war generation. She was a woman who believed in German renewal. She had the fortunate, you know, what they call the luckiness of being born too late in German society, too late to have been a witness or a perpetrator in the war, but he wasn't. He was of that. And so I think ultimately underneath, that was part of what the attraction was for her. She had to solve something in his character. And I think that's part of what she was drawn to. Like right at the beginning of the book, when she first hears his name and hears that he's done something very brave, she says, I'm going to invite him to the Greens. And Manfred says, what are you going to do? Gentle the general? You know, are you going to change the world one general at a time? And I think that's kind of set up as one of the things that she is going to try to do. She is going to try to prove that we are a savable society by renewing the general. And that becomes the fight of her life. And yeah. That's how I would
Quite
describe
literally.
that. Quite literally the fight of her life. And then they start to act on each other too, because she was also no picnic to be involved with. You know, she's like, she was, you know, a larger in life iconic flame. And he decided that at the age of 60, married to a perfectly wonderful woman, he decided to go and, you know, throw himself into the flame of love and try to come out like a phoenix renewed. And you know, what a thing to attempt, you know. And I don't think it was, I think it was probably incredibly painful. So then I was just trying to show, you know, them acting on each other in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we should say something about the fact that as we're talking about these historical character people, that that they become different once they in the novel. That you know, we have to. They're not anymore who the historical people. I'm sure if they were here watching us, they'd be horrified and say, I didn't mean that, I didn't think that, I didn't say that. that once they're transmorgified in fiction, you know, all our pronouncements are really about the fictional people we created based on those characters.
Maybe we got it right.
Maybe we did. Wouldn't it be wonderful?
We kind of hope we did, right? That by staring at them in that kind of way that novelists stare at things, we ultimately got a little bit tugged a little deeper, which Caroline, okay, so can you speak to that with A Russian Sister? So I know, because we had countless glasses of red wine at the Dunbar together, that one of the things that so fascinated you was that almost unwritten about trauma in the background of Chekhov's character. Yeah. So can you talk about exploring that and what that was like?
Yeah. So when you read these biographies of them, and they always talk about he was this great womanizer, and how he would get involved with these women, and then as soon as the deed was done, as soon as their love was consummated, it was like he couldn't tolerate continuing anymore. He didn't have long-term relationships with women. He later they could become friends, but only after all the emotion was put away on her part. So a number of Masha's friends, part of the novel is, and when I said Masha's involvement, is that he took up with many of her friends, and it began reading about that. I thought that it was slightly creepy how many friends of hers she was involved in, and that she would bring them home after women weren't allowed to go to university at that time, so they took these things called Professor Guerrier's higher courses for women, and then they would go to Masha's house because she had 3 older brothers who were very good looking, and they all had affairs with him and the other brothers too, but mostly Chekhov, and many of them never got over him. And they talk about this, and yet nobody ever seemed to put together the fact that he was brutally beaten as a young child by his father. The 3 older brothers all were. One became falling down alcoholic, like falling in the street, disappearing for days, complete drunk. The older one was a terrible alcoholic but could hold it on together, and Chekhov pulled himself up and supported the whole family, and he prevented that from happening to himself, but he had suffered the same, and it really kind of is the key. And in the novel, there's a central metaphor about Sakhalin Island, his going to that penal colony, and which exists for the purpose of punishment. And he wrote about it himself in one of his stories, in particular 3 Years is his most autobiographical fiction, and he talks about the effect of having been brutalized as a child. It's very, very terrible to read, what had happened to him.
It's amazing how much you learn. I mean, with historical fiction, but all these novels have so much extra depth to them, and I came out, learning so much about the Impressionist painters, in particular about Chekhov, and about the Green Moon, which oddly enough, Shayna, with Petra, I lived in those times. I remember the wall fell, but it's almost like you've forgotten. It was like a memory boot,
Yeah. And that's what's important about Shayna's novel is let's get this woman back in history, right? It's shocking.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of her.
But I felt the same way about Berta Morisot. I mean, I had thought about the Impressionists. I've looked at tons of Impressionist paintings, but it never really came alive to me till I read your book, Dede.
Well, she hasn't really been acknowledged that much, except for the last 10 years.
Yeah. And then when you see the paintings,
not much written about her.
Yeah. Amazing. And I mean, I saw that there were a couple of shows, pretty big, what are they, retrospective shows or shows that are featuring her now. I think yeah. So maybe in the last 10 years, but I didn't feel like I got so interested, and now I feel like it's planted in my head, and I will never see the Impressionists the same way, And I look at her paintings, and I think, what a genius,
Oh, absolutely. They actually say, people, art critics say that she, more than any of the other Impressionists, represented the thesis of Impressionism, her work.
We have lots of questions.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to note, we were going to talk about craft, we could talk for hours. This is just so fascinating. But certainly for a lot of people listening who are writers or lovers of fiction and writers and all those things, we can, you know, the novels, like Caroline, for your novel has this fabulous use of subtext. They all do, but subtext is very hard to write. And of course, Chekhov not invented it, but would you say he invented it? More or less, like this powerful subtext and sensibility and how you work with that in the novel, I think is fascinating. And in Shayna's novel, we have this, you know, shifts through the decades and times, and the shifts in the POV, but are still very tight POV through Manfred, which is an ingenious, you know, device. And they're all like master classes really in craft. And Dede, you know, your description is so important because we're talking about art, right? And it's very hard to get that balance and to try and I could see these paintings, you know, I did, you know, I started Googling. I didn't want to Google too much because I didn't want any spoilers, but I would Google and, you know, just that's what they look like. That's how they pictured in my head.
Don't Google the people, just Google the paintings.
Yes, everybody don't Google, because I did, and you're going to wreck it. Just look at the pictures.
All the paintings.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. One question, if anybody has a book club, I'd like to know what they would have to serve. Like, what would you
Oh, well, I can answer first, because I actually have a food metaphor embedded in the book. It comes in the middle of the novel, and then it's at the very end, and that's the Russian honey cake, which I have had, but I looked it up to see how to make it, and it's so incredibly complicated. So you make it's got between 8 and 14 layers, and it turns out you don't like a normal layer cake where you bake it and then slice. You actually bake each layer, you smear it onto parchment paper and bake each individually, and then you put this honey sour cream mixture and glue it all together, and it looks like a great heap of nothing, just like a mess. And then you put it in the fridge, and then gradually all the layers are absorbed, and then you it's just extraordinary. So I'm going to try to make one day, but it's not a pandemic dessert, because you go to all that work and then you have to eat it yourself. So
yeah, I suppose, right, in the future, well, yeah. Virtual, eat it by yourself. Shayna, what do you think?
Oh, well, Manfred, my narrator, is constantly eating. So I would say that, you know, German beer and bratwurst is heavily featured. But Petra would go for, you know, days without eating properly, and people were trying to feed her. Lovers were trying to feed her, you know, because she was one of those people who would work and work and work and forget to eat. So some combination of, you know, dishes that were, you know, a spanferkel on a platter, you know, one of the pigs with the, you know, apple in its mouth, I think should be featured at the book club. And then, you know, sort of off to the side, a few peas.
Well, classically, I would suggest you get a good French red, Cabernet Sauvignon, perhaps, good French cheese, some Comis pears, if you can find them. They were all over Paris when I was there. And I had never had one before, and they're fantastic. And then what I had there also was rillette, which is like a shredded duck pate. It was duck rillette on French bread, slathered with butter first. The richest thing you could possibly eat. Fantastic.
Delicious.
Well, that sounds great.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to do some questions from the audience, because they can't actually work. So just 2 secs here. I find my glasses and find a question. Ready? Okay. I know there was one about the mongoose.
Yeah.
Roberta.
Yeah. That was sent to me ahead of time. Yeah, it was what does Svolach symbolize? Yeah. So I think it's really important to realize that first and foremost, anything in a novel is what it is. So he really is a mongoose, and Chekhov really had a mongoose. But it's true that anything, as if it continues, can accrue layers of meaning. So I think to Masha, he becomes a kind of a love object. Sometimes he seems like a lover, the love she's so desperate to have, and and sometimes he seems like the child she'd never have. And so when at one point he escapes, and then eventually a little bit of a spoiler, he's taken from her, and so the way she mourns him is not at all like a pet. It's really like that was her last chance for love. It's yeah.
It's so interesting. Oh, so I was going to say, it's so interesting the way that you do that, and the mongoose's ferociousness, I think, represents something about the scary nature of love and marriage at that time.
Right. And the mayhem he creates everywhere he goes, and
yeah.
And the wildness. It's a wild beast of a thing.
He's a wild beast. Yeah.
Wild animal.
A question from Kat Nichols. She asked how you decided to begin your novels, like the important catalyst, that important starting point. I think for many writers and everything, it's always, where do we begin? And the beginning sets the template really, and sets the ending. So did you have to really tinker with that, or how did you decide?
Certainly, you have to tinker constantly. I've written so many versions of this novel, but I started this one with the fictive present, with Petra being an older woman, and she's caring for her very, very ill daughter, and that's set. And she sets out the worry for the daughter that she's going to be plagued with gossip about her father, who her father is. So trying to set up a hook in the beginning, and then it's the reason for writing the account that she wrote for her daughter, basically.
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful way to do it, especially when you read the beginning and then you read the end, and then it all sort of falls into
bringing the the way she had the second person addressing.
Yes. I did a little jump, a little clap when I realized where the title came from. One Matter Woman.
Me too. Yeah.
Don't say anything.
I won't. And Caroline, did you find it?
Yeah, well, in A Russian Sister, it's really it's the novel is like art imitating life, and Chekhov did that all the time. A big part of it is about him stealing or borrowing other people's stories and using them in his fiction, for which he got in trouble a lot. So there's what it turns out to be is these layers of art imitating life imitating art. So the whole thing is really rather structured like a play. So I thought I'm going to start it as if it's a play, and so it starts with the entrance of the love interest, Lika Mizanova, into the home of the Chekhovs, and it follows through almost in scenes like a play.
Yeah.
And it goes till the 7 years. So it goes from when they were introduced, Chekhov and Lika Mizanova, and it ends after the premiere of The Seagull, which is the play he borrowed her life to write.
Fascinating. Shayna?
Yeah, I began Petra in a different place. I began it with, I had a sort of long, almost prologue-ish scene of her walking through a meadow with her father. And it took me several drafts before I realized I'm not too crazy about prologues. I didn't know why I was doing it like this. And so then I ended up starting it where it really should begin, where she first hears about the general when she's having a bath, and she sees the general has done this act of bravery that is reported in the newspaper. So once I hit that, I was happy with it, and I didn't change it after that.
Awesome. Okay. Hold on. Do you think this is from Lisa Curry? Do you think how would they fare in today's society in a nutshell? Like how would they be influential? Would they do things differently?
Boy, hard to know, really. Because the limitations of of her society, Berta's society, you know, it helps to form her. So you wonder if she was in today's society with all this freedom, if she'd be squeezed in the same way and even have to express herself through her art. Yeah, I don't know.
Caroline, do you think she?
Well, I was thinking Masha lived until her 90s, and she never did marry. She received in her lifetime 4 proposals, and yet she never married. And so I wonder if she would have done things differently. Yeah, given their connection. She might have stayed single, and who knows, maybe she certainly would have been more professionally fulfilled in today's society. Yeah.
Yeah, you see these in historical, it's always like the stakes are so high for everybody, but for women, there was constant hurdles and complications that make for great storytelling, but make us glad we don't live there. Right?
Yeah.
Shayna?
Yeah, just quickly, I sometimes do picture her being around right now. I think she would be an incredible fighter in this present time of climactic crisis and emergency. So yes, and what I picture is that these flame bearers, these women like her or Greta Thunberg or Rosa Luxemburg or Sophie Scholl, they are kind of with us, you know. I mean, obviously Greta is alive and she is with us, but all of these women, some of whom have been erased, that were these great activists, I do think of them as kind of being near right now during this time of emergency. And I think that I feel excited to kind of be doing some kind of active alchemy to kind of bring back Petra a little bit into the conversation, because she is a powerful woman and she would be so outraged with what is happening. And she would be so full of, she would never stop. She would never say, it's hopeless. She wasn't that kind of person, you know. She was just a person who always believed in her own power and always believed in the fight, no matter how difficult it was for her personally, no matter how much she became ostracized by the people around her. She still kept fighting, and I think that was part of her nature. And I think we need some of that strength right now.
It's wonderful. We're going to wrap up. This was there's many questions, and I'm yeah, this was delightful, and thank you so much for being here and for answering all these wonderful questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was just fantastic. I know seeing the responses coming in from people in the chat, everybody has been delighted by this and can't wait to read the books. So thank you so much, Claire, Caroline, Dede, Shayna. It's been such a treat to hear about your books, hear your discussion between each other. Like, I love the fact that you've all read each other's books and you have so much to talk about and relate to. It's just been so interesting. I also want to give a very, very big thank you to Jacqueline Hodson at HarperCollins, who has graciously been managing all of the Zoom tech for this event. We would not be here tonight without her hard work behind the scenes. I am not a Zoom expert and I don't know how to run that. So thank you, Jacqueline. And thank you to the other publishers who have helped out. That's Freehand Books and Penguin Random House Canada, and all the work that they do to support authors and bring events to us. And thank you to each and every one of you in the audience who has been tuning in. I know there's lots to compete for your attention, especially when everything is on Zoom right now, and many of you are working on Zoom, etc. So to have given your time to us, that's really wonderful to see so many people tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm just glad we could come together and celebrate these fantastic books, even if it's via screen when we can't all meet in person. If you look at the chat box at the bottom of your screens, I've posted the link to buy books a couple of times. I hope you do. If for those of you who haven't purchased the books already, I hope you can support the authors. I know you'll all want to read the books now because, as they said, you need to be able to read it to find out what has happened to these fabulous women in history, and don't Google to spoil it. And also remember, the holidays are just around the corner and books make great gifts. And as I said before, we do have signed copies of Petra and A Russian Sister, and I know Dede will be coming by the store soon to sign our copies of One Matter Woman. So thank you again, everyone. It has been just a truly awesome evening, and I hope everyone agrees. And thank you for all of your hard work in bringing this together.
Thank
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Moderator and all of you in the audience as well.
Thank you.
Take care. Good night.